Hello and welcome to this webinar number 9 in a series of building safety webinar series covering the topics of safety case report preparation and high-rise buildings. These webinars have been put together to assist building safety management teams, building safety engineers, building owners and other key players in the building safety environment with the topics of maybe useful to them with regards to preparation and of safety cases for these higher risk buildings. This series is based on the work of the working group of engineering led up by the Competence Steering Group, established to support implementation of recommendations in the Building a Safer Future report. The working group, known as Working Group 1, has been led by the Engineering Council and is a collaborative project between a number of professional engineering institutions and other partners. This webinar Number 9, covering the topic of risk assessment. My name is Andy Lidstone. I'm a technical expert with Risktec Solutions Limited. We are a safety and risk management company, assisting our clients primarily within the higher hazard industry, higher hazard facilities, in the understanding and the management of their risks. As I said, there are a number of these webinars that have been put together to assist persons in this area, covering a number of different topics. And this one, number 9, is intended to give an introduction to the concepts and approaches required with regards to risk assessment, how we can approach it, how we can understand and manage our risks better. The objectives of putting together all of these webinars is to, as you see up on there, is to help those involved with the maintenance, the operation of higher risk residential buildings in achieving a higher level of safety within their buildings. Important to recognise that these webinars, they are limited in time, evidently, so that they only can provide an introduction to the topics involved in the preparation of safety case reports. We can't cover absolutely everything within a single hour's webinar. So these are intended to be here as signposts to provide basic information to people, and also to highlight areas that might be of interest, highlight areas that may be of where people might wish to gain more information, to gain more training. At that point, my contact details will be at the end of this webinar, and always very happy to discuss, provide further clarification of any of the topics that have come up during this set of webinar. And final point to raise, it's important to remember that any of the opinions expressed within this webinar are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the IMechE who are hosting this webinar series, or of any of the other organisations within this who are putting together this set of webinars. It's also important to recognise that building safety and the development of these safety cases to improve the safety of high-risk buildings is a fairly rapidly developing situation. The guidance is continuously being developed, and therefore there is a fair bit of change that is happening. So although this is a fairly generic topic that I'm going to cover within this webinar, it's always important to make sure that you are always aware of what is the most current guidance available, particularly from regulatory bodies, to make sure that you are fully up to date with their expectations and best practice within the industries at that point. So moving into the topic of the webinar itself. This webinar is looking at risk assessment and the requirements and the practices, and how we can go through and look at better understand how we can use risk assessment to better understand our risks. Now, up a couple of key extracts from legislation here. We've got the parts from the Building Safety Act, Part 4, which, as we can see up there, says that an accountable person for an occupied higher risk building must, as soon as reasonably practical after a relevant time, assess the building safety risks as regards the part of the building for which they are responsible, and that these assessments must be made initially and then at regular intervals throughout the lifetime of the building, and at any time that the accountable person has reason to suspect the current assessment is no longer valid. So this places a couple of specific requirements onto us. One, we have to do the risk assessment, but also that we shouldn't, this is a through life obligation. This is a through life requirement at this point. We have to make sure that our risk assessments, our understanding of how we manage the risks in our buildings is fit for purpose when we start operating, when we have when we first do the risk assessment, but that we have to go back and we have to revisit this on a regular basis after to make sure that that it is still continues to reflect reality. And also this idea that if there is any suspicion that the current assessment is no longer valid, things will change. The way that we operate the building will change. Possibly the risks, the scenarios that we're responsible for managing may also change. So we have to go back in, and if there is a management of change process, or is there a prompt to say that things are changed, then we have to revisit the risk assessment at that point. The second piece of extract in there again is looking at taken from a different piece of legislation, but again the accountable person must include a description of all of the possible scenarios of building safety risks. We'll come on to the definition later of what we mean by risk, and also the specific requirements of the legislation as to what building safety risks have to be included, but that the onus sits on, I use the phrase duty holder, but the accountable person, that they have to do the risk assessment. They have to understand the likelihood of these risks being released, and also that the assessment of the likely consequences if those risks were to materialize. So before we go into this in a lot of detail, a few definition slides as to what we're likely to be talking about, some of the terms I'm going to be using as we go throughout all of this. Now, risk is determined at, you can see up there, the chance of a certain level of harm occurring. It includes two key points within that. There is the likelihood of the harm occurring, and there is also the consequences, what may go wrong if that hazard is released at that point. So likelihood, the chance of an unwanted event occurring, the loss of the control, the hazard being released, and if that loss of control happens, the hazard is released, then we have the severity of the outcome. And depending on the type of risk assessment we're doing, there may be different severities of outcomes that we're worried about, different outcomes, harm to people, harm to the environment, harm to assets, etc. Primarily for this sort of the risk assessments we're talking about within this webinar, we're looking at the safety to humans. So we're looking, the consequence primarily that we're looking at is the severity of the outcome affecting human beings at that point. Now, risk is present in everything that we do. We're present within our leisure activities, it's present within our industrial activities. The important thing is, though, that we understand the risks that we face. We understand how likely it is that those risks can be released. We understand the potential outcomes, so we have a good appreciation of what it is we are responsible for managing, and therefore we can make sure that we have suitable and sufficient controls in place to be able to manage those risks at that point. A couple of other terms that will come up as we go through. A hazard. We talk a lot about sort of hazards, present hazard identification, etc. A hazard is very simply is something with the potential to cause harm, something to cause harm to something that we care about. Primarily, as I said, this is going to be has the potential to cause harm to persons. And if we lose control of that hazard, we stop managing that hazard is released, then there may be consequences that arise from that. primarily, within the context of building safeties, where the hazard is the structure, is the flammable materials within the building. They have the potential to cause harm. The structural integrity of the building, if that is not effectively managed, that has the potential to cause harm. The likelihood of these consequences, once the hazard has been released, the flammable materials have ignited, then that determines the risk we have in place. So that gives us this link from the release of the hazard leads to the potential harm in place. So that's the scenario we have to understand. That's the scenario we have to manage. Now, for us, then, we need to be in the position of putting in place barriers, controls, layers of protection, however you want to phrase it. All of those are the things we have to put in place that acts to prevent the hazard from leading to the harm. Now, we'll come on to this in a bit more detail as we go through, but we have the opportunity, the possibility of preventing the hazard from being released, or if the hazard is released, then we have the possibility to mitigate the harm, to protect the people in place. So we have this concept of barrier management. And the diagram that we've got on the right-hand side of the screen here is, it's a very simple representation. It's often called as a Swiss cheese, that we put in place these barriers. Now, these barriers may be people, processes, plant. We put in the right equipment that's operated by the right people with the right information, and those are the layers of protection that we put in place to prevent the hazard from leading to the harm. But we have to recognize that none of these barriers are ever going to be 100% effective. There is always going to be the possibility that there are weaknesses, the holes in the cheese, these weaknesses that might allow for the hazard to be released. Now, if all of them, it may be that some of those weaknesses exist for a long time. Some of our layers are always weak. They always allow the passage of the harm to come through. But it's only when all of the holes within the barriers line up on that one particular day that's when the consequence arises. Now, this leads then into a very important point that, this is why we investigate near misses, because near misses will tell us if, say, the first barrier in our layer of defences has failed. And so that if we have a near miss, then we can investigate that near miss, and that would tell us, yes, we can repair that barrier before there's something passes through it and possibly challenges the integrity of the second barrier. But these holes, they might exist for a number of possible reasons. They may exist. I've got them up there talking about active and latent failures. Now, these barriers will have holes in them. Those the weaknesses within those barriers. You can see there what I'm talking about: active and latent failures. The latent failures might be things that are introduced by failure in designs. We don't particularly we don't do we haven't identified all of the things that can possibly go wrong, so we don't design against them, or we don't provide the barriers as being robust enough to be able to manage them. Equally, so that the barriers, the controls are never going to be good enough, and that would be an example of a latent failure. But equally, we may have active failures, and these active failures are things that are being introduced during the lifetime. That a person is responsible for maintaining a piece of equipment, and that they have insufficient knowledge to allow them to adequately maintain that piece of equipment. That piece of equipment no longer performs its function, and therefore we have introduced a weakness within that barrier. So that would be an example of an active failure. So basically, when we're talking about risk assessment, what we're trying to do then is to understand the scenarios, the hazard that leads to the harm. That's what we're responsible for managing, and then the barriers that we put in place so that we can make sure that those barriers continue to work. But we also have to be aware of this concept of weaknesses. So the better we understand the barriers, the more we can identify the weaknesses. The more we identify the weaknesses, the better we can fix those weaknesses, make sure that the barriers don't fail when we need them to work, and therefore we continue to manage the hazards, we don't have the harm resulting at that point. So all of really what we're trying to do with risk assessment is to make sure we understand what we have. The better we understand, the better we manage it at all these points. Now, there's a number of different drivers. Sorry, so how things might go wrong in your building, other things that make it worse, the holes, the potential consequences, and the barriers. How do those barriers work at that point? Now, there's a number of drivers as to why we may be wanting to look at why people across all industries want to be out there to go out and manage those risks. The end objective for all of these is effectively, as I said, the better we understand our risks, the less surprises we will have. So we're looking to protect the value, to make sure that harm doesn't occur, that we have better, safer buildings at that point. Now, there are going to be drivers that are internal to ourselves. We want, because it is our organisations, our own personal responsibilities, we want to do the best. There are also in some areas of industry, some areas of life, where there might be legislative drivers to make sure that we do actually manage our risks effectively. There's also going to be occasions where there's societal concerns that are driving us to assess particular types of risks, or where societal expectations expect us to look into particular areas of risk in a more difficult area. So there's a lot of things that are going to drive us, but the end point is that the better we understand the risks, the less harm is going to occur at the end of it. So that the end goal is, as I've said a number of times, we understand the risks that we face. We've got enough information to be able to make informed decisions, and we face a wide range of risks that we're responsible for managing within our organizations. This idea of the risk triangle, from the intolerable risks, the broadly acceptable risks at the lower ends, and the tolerable, if all measures necessary have been put in place, within the middle. And so that we need to have a proportionate approach towards understanding these risks, and to make sure that we manage them effectively. But if we understand the risks that we face, we can make better quality decisions as to whether or not we are still continuing to manage those risks at that point. And I firmly believe that any risk assessment process is an opportunity for us to be able to improve. So the better we understand what we have, the better we can start looking at, is this the best that we can practically do? And to ask ourselves, yes, this is what we have, but could we actually do it any better? To challenge ourselves at that point. Have we done all that is necessary, all the reasonable steps, but also that we can look to see if we continuously improve at that point, so long as those things are reasonably practicable at that point. And we also have a requirement to be able to demonstrate all of this, particularly if we're in a legislative requirement that we have to be able to prove to ourselves, so we have to give ourselves assurance that we're managing these risks effectively, but also we have to provide assurance to other interested parties. There are other stakeholders. They may be regulators, partners, other organizations, the public, depends on the level of risk, that we can provide demonstration assurance that the risks remain the same, the controls remain the same, that the risks continue to be managed. Again, going back to this concept of through life throughout all of this. So this is where we want to finish up. We want to finish up with a compliant and safe building. So the better we can structure our approaches towards this, the better we will achieve those objectives at that point. Now, this structure, this picture I've put up on here, this is the basic processes that are put in place by, this is the ISO 31000 standard. The ISO 31000 standard is a general approach towards risk assessment. It's agnostic as to whether or not you're looking at safety risks, environmental risks, business risks, whatever. It's a general approach towards risk assessment, and it works very, very well as a basic starting point for all of this. And the remainder of this webinar is going to be based around these concepts. So The starting point within this is the scope, the context, the criteria. What do we want to achieve? How are we going to go about doing it? How are we going to know when it's good enough? That's one of the key aspects within the context. How are we going to assure ourselves at the end of this that we are doing a good enough job? Once we've decided what we want to achieve, we set out what we want to achieve, then that leads us into the risk assessment part within this. Now, this risk assessment part, you can see there's three key parts to that. The risk identification, what have we got? The risk analysis, how bad can it be? And how do we manage it? And then risk evaluation, is that actually good enough? Are we meeting our objectives? Are we doing a satisfactory job of managing those risks at that point? And at the end, then that gives us, given the knowledge that we have in place, the ability to be able to treat those risks. Can we make those any better? Because it might be that we are using the risk assessment process to improve our knowledge, to challenge our assumptions, to challenge the integrity of our risk management processes. So there may well be that we identify weaknesses, these holes within the cheese I was talking about earlier. We identify those, we can treat those, but we also, within risk treatment, we can look to improve and look to see if we do X, will that change the level of risk, which then might change our approach towards the evaluation of the risk. So that is sort of, in a nutshell, the basic of the risk assessment part. And you can see there is the recording and reporting parts, depending on the context of what we're looking at. That might be internal, it might be external, probably going to be both at that point. There's also a couple of things on the side of this that you can see throughout this. And with communication and consultation, it's important that I mentioned the idea of stakeholders at the beginning, that these people are aware of what's in place, are aware how well these are managed, but also we have the internal stakeholders, ourselves, that we can assure ourselves that we are doing these things. And communication in this point is a two-way process. It's not us telling people, this is what we've got. It has to be two-way. But also, it's important to make sure that, particularly when we're looking at this risk assessment part, that we use the people who are knowledgeable about the scenarios that we are responsible for managing at this point. So we are reflecting reality. We are reflecting what is actually there, so that we are using the knowledge that people are giving us. And on the right-hand side, we have this idea of monitoring and review. Monitoring, if we're going to make claims that we've identified these risks, we have these controls in place, and that leads us to a particular evaluation of the level of risk, then that gives us an onus. We have a responsibility to make sure that those risks continue to be managed, those barriers continue to work. So we have to be in the position of monitoring those. But also, the risks might change. There may be things that are introduced into our building where we do maintenance works, users within the building change. So those might introduce new risks. So we have to go back in and to look at whether or not our risks that we've identified still remain current throughout the lifetime of the building, which was something I mentioned on one of the earlier slides. So that leads us into this concept of monitoring and review. And as you can see, it's intended to be a continuously updated process, that we are aware of what we have and we continue to manage those things. Now, everybody likes an acronym, so PACE on the right hand side there. The level of risk assessment that we do has to be proportional to the level of risk that we're dealing with. We're not asking everybody to turn everything into a huge great paper chase, but we have to be proportional to the levels of risk that we're dealing with, and our risk assessment processes have to be part of what we do within our organization. It's not that risk assessment is some sort of bolt-on that we just add on to the end of it, but risk assessment has to be something that we can deal with within our organization, something that is an intrinsic part of the way that we do it. It covers all of the risks, and that we can adapt to changing circumstances throughout all of this. So it's key that we make sure that we start thinking about the risks that we have on a regular basis, not as a bolt-on afterthought that just comes in after the point. So a couple of things that come out of something like that, if a hazard that we don't know about is something we are not going to be managing effectively. So a hazard that's not been identified is a hazard we may be managing it, but we're managing it by accident. So if we can't control a hazard that has not been identified. The better we do our jobs with regards to identifying and assessing our hazards, the better we will manage those hazards, because we understand how they can be released. We understand the controls that we have in place. So that once we have identified these scenarios, then that gives us the opportunity to start looking at these controls, and therefore to make sure that the controls continue to work, and these risk reduction measures, these controls, barriers, however we frame them, and make sure that they are and remain effective at managing those risks at that point. We may be in the position of looking to identify further risk reduction measures, but up until the point where we actually put those further risk reduction measures in place, then those things are not going to, the risk does not diminish at that until those measures are actually put in place. The better we use our knowledge, our experience of all parties who have relevant information, the better our risk assessment processes are going to be. And as I mentioned a number of times throughout all of this, we have to be in the place of continually assuring us that the controls that we put in place are good enough, that they are doing what we expected them to do. We identified during the risk assessment process, we would say, well, I put this control in place and it will do X. Well, therefore, if it does this, then the risk is being effectively managed. If we're going to make that claim, then therefore we have to be in the position of assuring ourselves that that control does its job throughout its lifetime. So we may require to put in place performance indicators that give us a warning if a control is not performing to that function, because if it's not performing that function, we're not managing the risk to a level that we thought we were, and therefore it may not necessarily be an acceptable risk to us at any point. So to help us with this, then there are a number of different types of approaches that we can put in place, and it's important, particularly with regards to building safety, that nobody's asking us to reinvent the wheel. We're not starting with a blank piece of paper. There are plenty of approaches, practicable approaches towards risk assessment, plenty of tools that have been developed over the years that can be adapted and repurposed. And we're going to cover a couple of these: hazard identification, what if, bow tie analysis. We'll cover these within this tool, within this webinar. And these are tools that have been developed elsewhere within industries, and they are very good tools that can easily be used within this. But there is a sort of a increasing level of detail in our risk assessment, and as a general rule of thumb, the more uncertain the risks, the bigger the risk, the greater our need for assurance, and therefore the greater our need for increasing levels of detail, different approaches within our risk assessment process. So at the beginning, we have codes and standards. Codes and standards give us an awful lot of information as to how we are going to effectively manage our risks at that point. They reflect the combined knowledge across an entire industry. If we do this, then we are going to manage our risks. But these are always going to be they are going to be general. They do not necessarily always reflect the specifics of our individual facility, our specifics of our individual building. Things are going to change, and we need to make sure that ours are specific at that point. We can build upon that by challenging those codes and standards, by making sure that we look to see what more can we do based around our knowledge, our experience, our judgment at that point. We can introduce specific risk assessment tools to help us build upon that, and then we can also start to challenge ourselves against other organizations, other industries, etc. at that point. So, as I said, the basic approach is to gradually get more complex as we need more. If we can if we can assure ourselves that we are managing our risks effectively, then we stop at that point. But if there is uncertainties, we may choose to get more complex. We might choose to look at one particular aspect in slightly more detail in some points. Again, it comes back to this concept of, can you assure yourself that you are managing these risks effectively for your particular facility, organization, area of responsibility? So going back now to the ISO 31000 document, the scope and context, the starting point, and this is important. If we get this bit wrong, we're going to set out down the wrong path, and it's not going to help anybody at that point. So the scope, what do we want to achieve? Now, largely the scope has been defined for us by the legislative requirements. We are looking at a particular class of buildings, we are looking at a particular class of hazards. But we also need to be able to look at this within the context of our own particular organization. And what is what are the abilities? What are the resources? What are the processes that exist within our organization to help us manage these risks? What are the approaches we are going to take to managing these risks? There's no point in going off down a particular risk assessment path that would not be valid for or practicable for the organization that we are responsible for at that point. How are we going to move information around? So that there are both internal factors and external factors. The external factors, what is the approach, the expectations of our stakeholders at that point might be a key part of that. What is the natural environment that surrounds us at that point? And the internal factors, as I said, things like the standards and guidelines, the information systems and flows in there at that point. So we have to set out, how are we going to do this? Is what we are planning to do going to be practicable? And a key thing within that is, how are we going to know when we get to the end? How are we going to judge the acceptability of the risks at that point? So that has to be set out before we start to get into this. As I said, the key context that we have within our whole area of building safety assessment is set out for us by the legislation, so that the Building Safety Acts requires consideration during, you can see up there, construction, partial occupation, refurbishment, all of these stages through life, because there are going to be risks that exist within the construction phase. The risks that are going to exist are going to be different, and possibly not all of the scenarios or all of the controls will be in place, because the building is not necessarily finished. But there are going to be new hazards that are introduced by the presence of construction. But we may have partial occupation during the construction process. So that gives us one particular set of risks. We need to make sure that those are managed. Then we can move from that into the full occupation, and to make sure that the risks we are managing throughout all of that continue to be looked at. Refurbishment, again, gives us a transient change in those risks. We may disable certain systems that we are requiring. It might be that certain, simple example, passageways might be blocked by the refurbishment, or that the refurbishment activities might introduce new hazards at that point. So our risks have changed. We have to make sure that those risks are continued to be managed. And the legislation is looking at particularly, but there are going to be lots of risks within a building, but the legislation is looking at these two particular issues: the spread of fire and structural failure at that point. There's also a key part within the Act that's talking about competency for persons assisting with the duties under the regulations. So that it's going to have two key parts. The persons who are doing the risk assessments have to be competent to do that, to have to be competent to offer opinions within that, but also the persons who are responsible for managing the controls, managing the various processes, etc., that we are relying on to continue to manage our building risks, also have to be competent to do those jobs. So once we've set out what we want to achieve, then that leads us then into risk identification. So the first parts of the risk assessment process: risk identification, risk analysis, identifying what do we have, and the risk analysis comprehending the nature of the risk and the level of risk. Primarily, you tend to think of this then as what are the controls we have in place? How are we managing these risks at that time? There's plenty of tools available to us. I mentioned, our own competence, our own judgment is a good part of it. Then there are structured approaches. The better we structure those approaches, the better hopefully our outcomes are going to be. So that's talking about things like hazard identification, both tie analysis, and there may also be numerical tools, and I'll touch briefly upon those at that point. There's no one size fits all, but the hazard and bow ties are very good tools and they work very well. But it's always important to sort of proof test the tools we plan to use. If I use this, will it give me the outcome I expect? Is it going to help me at that point, to help me understand what we have in place at that point? And it's very important that this reflects reality. The risk assessment has to reflect what we have, not what we wish we had. So that, again, this is why I was talking about communication, consultation, making sure that people, if we are doing structured processes to identify the hazards, structured processes to look at the controls we have in place, it's important that those are using the knowledgeable people who can talk knowledgeably about what they do, and also identify the weaknesses. These are holes within the cheese. The better we identify those, the sooner we can fix those at that point. So there are a key process that we have within risk identification, hazard identification, to provide a structured approach. Now, hazard identification, sometimes people will talk about what if as well. Well, it's a slightly different tool, but they're both structured processes to identify hazards. They are generally looked at as collaborative workshop type exercises where we are bringing together a group of people to challenge, to identify the hazards that we have in place at that point. So I've always talked about this idea of knowledgeable people. So if we are doing a hazard, and most of the time when we're talking about hazard, we're looking at challenging to look at our building against a series of checklists that are there to prompt discussion to identify, does this risk actually exist at that point? So to involve people with knowledge about the operational history of the building, the construction of the building, the history of the building, the way it's operated, the systems within it, how we continue to maintain it at that point. Don't get carried away. There's no point in having hundreds and hundreds of people in the room. There's no point having, typically 6, 8, 10 people involved within this is a good starting point. And there are areas possibly we can't manage, or areas we don't know about, and we have to be prepared to go out and collect more information, recognize what we don't know, and collect information at that point. But if we have 20, 30 people in a room, we're never going to get anywhere at any point because there's going to be too many opinions. We have to make sure that we look at all the areas, the uses of the building, the things that are going to change, and to look at making sure that we consider all the activities that happen, all the possible uses that are going to happen at various phases, and to look at how things might change. Now, it might be that you start off with your building during its most normal operation, so it's occupational phase, and then you would come back and revisit that. We are planning to do further constructional refurbishment at 6 months in the future. We'll come back in and we'll look at the risks we identified. How are they going to be changed by the activities that we're going to do at some point in the future? So how you approach this is going to be up to you. It might be that you want to look at different, so we challenge ourselves against this checklist by looking at the different uses within the building. So there may be there's obviously going to be residential usage, there may be trade usage, there may be light industry usage within the building. So we might want to look at all of the hazards that exist with residential, or the hazards that exist with retail, or that we can look at it by floor and work our way through, or by individual responsibility. Equally, we could look at the building as an entirety and to challenge ourselves there about, to look at all of these. And what we want to achieve is we want to understand the scenarios we've got, what might cause fire to happen, what might cause structural failure to happen, how it might develop, and what controls we have in place. And these controls, as I mentioned earlier, we've got the ability to prevent risks from occurring. We have the ability to mitigate those risks at those points. The law, or sorry, the regulations don't prescribe one way or another, but we have to make sure that whatever tool we use to identify the risks, identify and manage the risk scenarios, is going to be fit for purpose. Now, what we need to be in the position of, as I said, is to identify the initiators, scenarios, and the controls. We can do that. I've mentioned these two tools, hazard and bow ties. We can use each by themselves. We can use both them as a collaborative approach, and use a hazard to identify the risks, the hazards, and the bow ties to allow us to identify the controls. Equally, you might choose to manage the controls. I can discuss the controls within the hazard. Both work. It's what works best for you. So we are looking at fire risks. We're looking at structural risks. So there are going to be a number of potential initiators with regards to fire risks: electrical faults, residence actions, deliberate acts. As I mentioned, construction activity. All of these might cause activities, but it's important to also recognize that, how might these scenarios develop, because though they may be restricted to a single floor, they may be restricted to a single compartment. Some of them may have the opportunity, the possibility of moving between floors or across the entire building. But also, we're going to have to start considering, well, what happens if the evacuation process doesn't work? What happens if the emergency response process is flawed, or doesn't work as we expect it? So that we are reflecting reality. We are allowing for our controls to possibly fail. So that this might change the scenario, how that scenario develops. As with fire risks, structural risks, again, how might these things be initiated, and how might they develop? So there may be degradation of our structural supports. There may be corrosion of our structural supports. There may be external factors undermining, compromising the foundations. The external factors that cause our systems to fail at that point. And again, as with fire risk, we have the opportunity to prevent structural failure to happening, but also to possibly mitigate that if that were to occur. And you can see there's also the possibility of crossover between fire scenarios compromising the structural integrity, so that a fire could possibly lead to a structural failure at that point, and that this structural failures might compromise the integrity of suspended walkways. That might give us one scenario. They might compromise the entirety of the building. They may compromise just one part of the building. But if that one part of the building is compromised, how do we then deal with those potential consequences at that point? So that we're looking, again, I know I recognise I'm repeating myself, but we're looking to look at the concept of the scenario. This leads to this, and then how do we manage that? The barriers, the controls that we have in place, and recognising that those controls maybe not work as we expect them to be. What if this happens? What if that happens? It should be a key part of what we're trying to do throughout all of this. Now, all of this needs to be recorded, bearing in mind we have to be in the position of communicating this internally and externally. So I've called this as a risk register. You may call it a hazard register, hazard effects register, or a faults register, whatever works best for you. But this risk register typically is going to be the outcome of our hazard identification exercise, that we've identified the things that can possibly go wrong, that can cause the loss of control, that could cause the fire, the structural failure to occur, how it might be developed, what we have to prevent, what we have to mitigate it, and what do we need to do better. That might be we need to understand something better. It might be that we need to change something at that point. Again, risk assessment is an opportunity for us to go out there and improve at that point. And we, again, as I mentioned, particularly with regards to these control areas, to make sure that we consider how they might fail, what weaknesses might exist within those at that point. We can use a risk assessment matrix looking at the likelihood and the severity. That may help to focus, may help to prioritize our appreciation of the risks, may help to prioritize our remedial actions to put in place. It's important to recognise, though, that the risk assessment matrix is there to provide guidance to us. It's not making the decisions on our behalf, and it's important not to get hung up on the particular the numbers and to spend an awful lot of time arguing about which box a particular risk exists. It's there to give us an indication and to help us make a decision. It's not making the decisions for us. So we can look at the risk controls, as I've mentioned, as part of the hazard identification exercise, and that might be what we look at in that point. We can also use this bow tie method, which I'll come on to in a couple of slides. But once we've identified the scenarios, we need to be looking then at the controls that we've got in place, this key part within the risk analysis part. So that the controls, what do we rely on? What allows us to sleep at night? What do we have in place that we have to make sure is going to work to stop the unwanted event from happening, and also to mitigate it were it to happen at that point? So it's going to be very much scenario specific. It's going to be hazard specific, whether some of them work for fire scenarios, some work for structural failure, some work for both. So that the specification, the design, the systems we have in place, how do we make sure that they continue to work? How a lot of it may well be about making sure that people are aware, that our contractors are aware that these are the controls we have to put in place to make sure that hot work does not lead to a fire. That these are the controls that our residents need to be aware of to make sure that fires do not occur. But also then there are the mitigations. If the fire has occurred, if the structural failure has occurred, how do we protect our people at that point? So how do we know we've got a problem? How do we detect that the problem has occurred? How do we alert people to that there is a potential? How do we stop it getting worse? How do we contain that fire within a particular residential area, within a single floor, etc.? So we may then start looking at the fire doors, the adequacy of our escape routes. How quickly can we respond? How quickly do we have to do various things at that point? And it may be useful to us to consider, because what we will need to be able to do is to look at the controls and to look at how well these controls are going to work. And then that allows us, when we get to the risk evaluation part, of whether or not those controls are adequate to manage the risk. Now, there is this concept then of the hierarchy of controls, that some controls are going to be more effective than others. So our first layer, the best control we can ever have is elimination, take away a hazard. If we have a fire source within a building, if we were to be storing flammable materials within the building, if we take those flammable materials away, we've taken away the hazard. We no longer need to manage the hazard. There's going to be a limited scope possibly for that, particularly with existing buildings, but we can eliminate the hazard, we can substitute it, we can have less hazardous materials, less hazardous working practices that might possibly take us a little bit longer to do, but have a risk reduction. That once we better understand the risks, we can start evaluating whether or not the risk reduction that comes from substituting a particular activity with a different one, whether or not the benefit we get from that is worth the possible increased time that we might have take us to do a particular thing. We can put in engineering controls, the fire doors, the escape routes, the door closing materials, etc. We can put in administrative controls, the building caretakers making sure that the rubbish is collected from underneath the stairwells and making sure enforcing the no smoking requirements. And we possibly PPE. I mean, we could possibly talk about smoke hoods or things like that. I mean, but so that as we're going down here, we are going generally, as a general principle, we're getting less effective as we go down this, because we're going from absolute safety through engineered safety to people-based safety. We're getting less effective. We're generally getting cheaper, but so when we're evaluating those controls, the controls we've got in place, we can look at the adequacy of the controls, but also the type of controls, such that if we are looking at one scenario and all of our controls are engineering based, and we're looking at another scenario and all of our controls are people based, then it should raise a question to ourselves. Okay, are we managing this as well as we can do? The second scenario may have less controls in place. We can't make that decision now, but it's a flag, it's a warning sign. It's a consideration for us to look at. As I said, we have to understand these controls so that we can make an informed evaluation. We may do that via the risk register on the previous slide. We may do this. Another tool that's very commonly used is called a bow tie. Now, bow tie is a graphical, qualitative approach towards evaluating our scenarios. And the basic concept of the bow tie is that we're looking at these threats can cause the release of the hazard, which can lead to the consequences, this scenario we're trying to manage. This causes this, results in this. The hazard being the flammable materials, the structural integrity of the building. So that if this can cause, so if a threat can cause the top event and results in the consequence, what do we have in place? What barriers do we have in place that stop it from happening? What are we relying on to prevent this potential cause leading to this potential scenario, the fire starts? And so it may be things like electrical faults, human errors, external influences. All of those have the potential to result in the fire starting, which could then lead to the loss of the building, multiple fatalities within the fire. Then we have these barriers. They may be the things I was talking about on the previous slide. What do we have in place? What are we relying on? And similarly, once the fire has occurred, how do we mitigate it? What are the layers of protection that act to reduce the likelihood we get to this, or to reduce the consequences of this event at that point? Now, we can also then start challenging ourselves. Is there anything that might cause these controls to fail? Are there any degradation factors that exist? These things that degrade the effectiveness of the barrier. So that on this side, we might have a barrier that we say, well, we have compartmentalization within our building because the fire will be contained within the apartment, because we have closing devices on the entrance doors, and they will make sure that the fire does not spread outside of the compartment. But it might be fairly common practice for those entrance doors to be propped open when people by the residents, so that degrades the effectiveness of that barrier. That introduces a hole into that barrier. Okay, so what barrier do we then have to do to make sure that this does not degrade that, such that our barriers are still working as well as we wanted to do? So we can build up this pictorial representation, have a discussion, communicate it, and build. Again, the better we understand, the better we manage. So this is an example of a bow tie. This is looking at an entire building. Maybe that you want to look at a particular floor or a particular activity. So you could do a smaller bow tie looking at different things. This one is looking at fire occurring. These might be things that cause the fire to occur, and then these are the potential outcomes. And once we know what we have, we can start looking at each individual one to say, okay, so these are a couple, and we can start looking at the barriers, the layers, the controls we have in place that stops this from resulting in this. And you can see we can start putting in place additional pieces of information. We can start grading it, so a simple traffic light to again help us make a decision as to how well we are managing this. We could look at possibly the risk control owner. We can look at improving upon it. You can see then, so we have this one, that we have a number of fairly effective barriers, whereas for this one we possibly have less effective barriers. Are we managing this risk effectively as this one? And we could also look at the potential for, if these things happen, then we degrade the effectiveness of these things. We're relying on that people cannot get into this room to possibly damage the equipment, but we recognise that the security measures may not necessarily be 100% effective, so that this degrades that. We can, all of these are the things that we are relying on to stop this from resulting in this. Once the fire has occurred, and we can draw up the same barrier, the same sort of basic structure for a structural failure. Once the fire has occurred, then how do we know we have a problem? How do we detect the fire? How do we stop the fire from spreading? If the fire were to spread, how do we get people to a place of safety? And again, particularly, as you can see on this one, that there are a number, with regards to the compartmentation, then there may be a number of things that might act to degrade this. And the controls, how do we assure ourselves that these controls have in place? What is the argument that we want to make as to why we are managing this risk effectively? The better we understand, and this sort of pictorial representation is a very good representation of how we manage these things, the better we can understand, the better we can challenge it. The better we challenge it, the more we understand. So hazard, what if, and or bow ties both allow us to identify the scenarios, and challenge the controls. It may be occasionally that there may be other questions that neither of these tools can answer. We want to better understand how a particular system might fail. So we want to ask very detailed questions. We want to better understand what the physical effects of the fire might be in a lot more detail. So there are other tools that can be used at that point: hazard and operability studies, failure modes and effects analysis, fault tree analysis. All of those would allow us to ask very detailed questions about the operation of the fire alarm system, the ventilation system. How might it fail? Where its weaknesses are at that point. We could look at evacuation modelling, modelling the flow of people through buildings, and see where the potential weaknesses, the choke points exist. And also we can do, very detailed modelling of how a fire might spread, and look at computational fluid dynamics, say, and look at that to tell us how the visibility within a corridor, with how the heat within a corridor, the oxygen might get depleted within an escape route. And again, for the scenarios we're considering, do we have enough controls in place? Will that escape route remain viable for the time we need it to do? So these are very specific questions. The key thing is we understand what we know, what we don't know, and that we can then identify what we need to find out to manage that. So once we've done the analysis part of it, then that takes us into the risk evaluation, comparing the results of the risk analysis with the risk criteria. How are we managing this risk effectively at this point, so that we can allows us to then start looking at, well, what further can we do, which leads us into the risk treatment part of it at that point. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, possibly understanding other analysis to better understand it, to look at the way that we are looking at the managing of our risks. Do we need to do further things to further better manage our risks at that point? So basically, we're now looking at how good are our controls. This is our scenario. These are our preventative mitigative controls. How good are they going to do? Are they going to do what we expect them to do? Do we know what we have to do? What do we know? What do we don't know? Maybe you have missing records that you can't inspect particular aspects of the building. If we can't verify it, then doesn't automatically mean that it's non-effective, but we may have less certainty that a particular control may work. Are they good enough? Are there enough controls? Are they good enough, robust enough to make sure that the risk is being managed? What about every control that we've identified is an opportunity for us to ask questions. How do we know that this is still going to work? How much how competent are the people who are looking after these controls? Do we have the assurance necessary to make sure that these controls are continuing to be effective? I mentioned earlier about this through life of monitoring and review. If you are going to claim to the stakeholders that these controls are going to work, how do you know they're continuing to work? And does the maintenance information tell you that this control is still continuing to manage? What information do you have? So sometimes it might be useful to establish performance indicators, to go out there and to give us early warnings, a red, yellow and green system that tells us if things are starting to break or not, starting not to meet their performance objectives. And also to go back in and start looking at things changing. The organization might change, the contractors we use might change. Does this change the effectiveness of our controls? And if we have these controls in place, then that allows us to start asking the question of, could we do anything more? Have we taken all reasonable steps? And is there any further reasonable steps we could do that would further reduce the risk at that point? And if there are reasonable steps we could put in place, are they practicable? What would be the benefits? What would be the sacrifices involved of putting in place these additional controls? Do we consider that that represents a practical solution? So when we're talking about, so that's risk evaluation. That tells us basically, very simply, are we good enough? If we're not good enough, then we can start looking at risk treatment so that we could, there are limited. There's basically four things we can do with treating a risk. We can avoid the risk. Might choose to say that this building is no longer safe. We cannot continue to use this particular part of the building, and so we can avoid the risk. Now that is obviously, it takes away the risk, but it's very, very disruptive. We could start to put in place further risk reduction measures, so we can put in place additional measures that may further reduce the risk. We may be in the possibility of transferring the risk to other organizations, other areas that's possibly going to be less applicable during housing. At the end of all of this, when we have treated our risks as far as is reasonably practicable, then we retain all of these risks within our organization. But this acceptance then means that we have to continue to monitor and review. You are making the claims, these controls manage these scenarios, therefore those controls have to be monitored and reviewed to make sure that that argument still remains the same. So I mentioned that when we're talking here about reduction in risk, the possibility of doing further things in place. So that have we taken all reasonable steps to manage this? So I tend to think of this as a series of hurdles to cross, or staircases to climb, if you like. And so the first step is to make sure that we are everything that we are relying on is in place with regards to the relevant safety standards, the relevant legislation, the codes, etc. That if we are not, then we have to do something about that, or we have to make a very strong argument as to why we are deviating from that, and these things will change. But then the building safety measures that we have in place, the engineering controls, the people controls that are put in place, gives us another layer that we have to go up and check. Are we doing that? Are they designed, installed, maintained, inspected by competent persons? And do they meet the manufacturer's recommendations? Are they meeting the standards that we expect them to put in place? If they're not, why not? Why is that acceptable to us? What more do we need to do in place at that point? And those two basic things will possibly get us through the first two steps. Then there is the responsibility, the onus on us to challenge ourselves and say, okay, can we do anything better? And if we can do anything better that would further reduce the risk, is that practical at that point? And that allows us then to go into the concept of sacrifice and benefits. How much risk reduction will we get? And that amount of risk reduction is going to be directly proportional to the amount of the effectiveness of our controls. If we've got very, very good controls, putting another layer on top may only get us a limited amount of benefit, whereas putting in place another control where we have weak controls gives us quite a bit of benefit. Against that, there is the cost feasibility of putting in place those controls, the sacrifices, and we need to be weighing that up to make a decision as to whether or not those things are practicable. At the end of all of that, then that takes us to the final parts of this, recording and reporting. That takes us to the safety case, communication and consultation. That's throughout the entirety of the risk assessment, the risk management process. That we have information coming into us, information going out from us to communicate this. And I've mentioned a number of times this idea of monitoring and review that the hazards haven't changed, monitoring and reviewing that the controls haven't changed, monitoring and reviewing that our acceptance hasn't changed. All of these things might change throughout time. So we need to be in the position of checking all of these aspects and revisiting them as required, which was one of the very early slides, which is one of the obligations of the Building Safety Act. With regards to communication and consultation, a key part of this is going to be the safety case report, particularly from the communication point of view. That is summarising, acting as the headline document to support the argument that the building is safe to occupy. So that is basically, that is the purpose of the safety case, to act as a headline, to act as a pointer to where more detailed information to support the arguments that we're making at this point, so that it summarizes all of the information. It's not just an information dump, it's not just throwing paper at it, it's a summary of that, demonstrates why we believe this building is safe, clearly links these controls back to the risks, whether or not you do that within the risk register table, where you do that within the bow tie, you do that within another mechanism. But it has to be, this is the scenario, these are the controls, this is why we think these things are going to be good at that point. The better we do this, the better we communicate this. The better we communicate it, the better everybody understands. The better everybody understands, the sooner we find the holes, the sooner we find the holes, the sooner we fix the holes. The sooner we fix the holes, the safer everybody is going to be at that point. What we're basically trying to do within the safety case is this concept of claim, argument, and evidence. We're safe. This is why. Here's the proof. That's what we're trying to do with all of this. So, key part, a structured approach towards risk management allows us to do a better job. There are basic steps towards risk management. What have we got? How bad is it going to be? Is that good enough? Given the controls we have in place, could we do anything better at that point? As I said, this has been a very, very brief run through of all of this topic. I hope it's been of interest and benefit to you. My contact details, are down on the bottom here. Very happy to sort of chat through or to elaborate on any things that may be of interest to you. And equally, please get in contact with us if there is anything more that we can do with regards to providing more information to you at any point. Thank you very much for your attention. And as I said, I hope you find that some of this was interesting.